This is the second video focusing on pathetic appeals within argumentation. Remember, we're taking a look at argument because the history of it tells us something about how it's been done well and how it can be done poorly. The introduction of Greek or ancient Greek classical elements of argument is meant to help give us some tools by which we can take a look at how arguments come to us, how we receive arguments both new and old, and how we create our own arguments. Pathos is the word that we ended on, having to do with appealing to emotions or appealing to our audience more generally. We've seen how it can be done poorly, how we can take unfair advantage of an appeal to an audience. We've also seen how it can be done quite well. Notice that we talk about fallacies in the context of pathetic appeals because they illustrate the edges of good appeals to our audience's emotions and self-awareness, and there are good ways to do that, such as when I come into class and say something like, if you want to get a good grade, if you want to be a good person at the end of all of this, if you want to respect yourself after having done this assignment, then you won't plagiarize, for example. But the other ways that we do this really happen quite frequently every day when we appeal to the interest of those people we're speaking to. We're engaging with them to try and get them involved in what we have to say. Let's go on to other parts of the argument. Ethos, having to do with the credibility of the speaker and writer. Remember, we see that word in the more modern day incarnations of ethic. We usually don't trust people if they are unethical, for example, but that's not the sum total of that word. It has to do with their credibility, of course. And like the appeals to pathos, it has its own fallacies attended on it. We'll just list one here. If we appeal to a vague or false authority or to tradition, false authority is one of those fallacies that's really quite broad because it can include so many things, including popular wisdom or bandwagon appeals. Remember, just because everybody's doing it or because we've always done it this way, those kinds of appeals are false authorities. We really ought to take a close look at why we do what we do. Good ethos or building good ethos for an argument really depends on having experts, finding them, talking about why they're expert. It involves showing fair-mindedness and even-handedness and being interested in your topic. It sounds really ridiculous, but the first step you can take in building good ethos is to have an interest in your topic, to show that you are involved in it, that you have a stake in it. So those people who've chosen something just by way of doing an assignment or fulfilling an expectation, you haven't quite committed. And so let me encourage you once again to commit to your topic. Find something that you can commit to and be engaged with. Now we've gone through this triangle and you can see we go back and forth. When you think about that last portion of the triangle, so I'll just ease right on over and take a look at it one more time. Before we start talking about fallacies, let's look at that logos, the logic of an argument, by first asking ourselves, how do we reach conclusions? How do we reach the conclusions that we do? It is, yes, by appealing to emotion. It is, yes, by building our authority. But Aristotle has us examining the process by which we reach conclusions and improve them. Remember that studying argumentation starts with a very definition of that old-style concept and term, and it's right here. We try to understand the process by which we reason things out. Well, okay, let's go back to our little thing here. There we go. How do we reach conclusions? What is the process by which we reach the conclusions? And can we improve that process? And sure we can. We've done it already for our assignments, but the book that attends this class, but also the discussion in class, focuses on how we reach conclusions through sensory details, which work but are not infallible. Sometimes there are drawbacks to them. Enumeration, we count how many times something happens. And analogical reasoning, as long as we have good analogies. I'll have talked about an analogy or two in class. I'll talk to you about those examples that are listed right below that in more detail, so be sure to attend class. Other ways that we develop good conclusions: we discover patterns, we reason from causes, we establish hypotheses and then test those hypotheses. And then we examine the statistics and tell us what they mean. These are all elements of inductive logic, or logos, as Aristotle would have defined them. We look at them here because we try to understand the process by which we do it now and see whether there's room for improvement. Like the other portions of the triangle, logos has its special spot because it has to do with the appeal to logic that we make. Not necessarily more complicated, but certainly having more parts or more tools that are available to us to analyze good logic. And remember that it can have good and bad logic, just as the other sections of the triangle. It's good to keep note of these since they'll be given an examination on them. But good logic, of course, avoids the hasty generalization, the false dilemma, which is an either-or. situation where you're either presented this option or another option. The questionable statistic, which is questionable not because you question it or you don't think it can exist, but because you wonder how they could have come up with that statistic in the first place. And that's a special kind of thing. Inconsistency, a contradiction, those should be pretty self-explanatory, though we'll practice with that in class. The loaded question, meaning that question's loaded so it presupposes a certain kind of answer. A weak or false analogy, questionable or false cause, slippery slope. All that is to say that the fallacies point to the good examples of argumentation, the good examples of logic that work quite well for us. We want to have sufficient evidence instead of creating a hasty generalization. We want to look at everything as if it's having multiple choices and not just two. A dilemma gives us really only two choices, two options available before us. We want to look for all the choices that are available. To have stats that aren't made up or guessed at. To be consistent and not contradict ourselves. To not load the question, or not to load the question. To find the right comparison or precedent. To find the relevant causes. And understand that not everything's going to fall apart with our solutions usually. Now again, if you've read about these, then you know that they're important. You know that they illustrate the boundaries, the edges of good logic. We practice with them more in class so that we can fine-tune them and be able to apply the language to them so that you can both memorize and understand how they work in specific application. For our purposes now here, understand that it's worthwhile mapping these out yourself, right, and creating examples, link them to the work that we're doing in class so that you retain and remember these as we progress closer to the test and also to the specific writing assignment that we're working on in argumentation. That's the value of the triangle. That's the value of having these new pieces of vocabulary.